across the political spectrum. You can see from very liberal people to very conservative people, there's not too much change in how much people are endorsing care and fairness. Binding values are higher in more right-wing individuals. They're endorsed to the same extent as those classic liberal values of harm and fairness in these right-wing individuals. But binding values are specifically devalued by more left-wing liberal individuals. Graham and colleagues investigated the extent to which moral foundations are associated with our gut reactions to social groups that are related to these different foundations. For example, in the Purity Foundation, people's attitudes toward atheists, prostitutes, homosexuals, people who have casual sex, people with tattoos and piercings, these were all polled in participants. Related to fairness, attitudes toward ACLU members, labor unions, and rich people were tested. For loyalty, attitudes about Americans, the US government, and flag burners were tested. And items were reverse scored as appropriate. Endorsement of the MFQ subscales predicted attitudes in a targeted way toward these groups of people. So let's break down Table 8 to see this. The results control for politics. If we look at the social group aggregate representing purity-related values, purity-related groups at the bottom line there, we can see that endorsement of moral values in the Purity Foundation using the MFQ most strongly predicted prejudicial attitudes about purity violators in those purity-related groups. Likewise, in-group loyalty values, these predicted people's attitudes about the members of loyalty-related groups more strongly than the other foundations. And this was also the case for authority values and harm and fairness values. So the moral values measure extends to let us know something about people's potential for prejudicial attitudes that are related to those moral values, even when we factor in people's politics. An important consideration is gender differences. In a very large sample, about 49,000 people, they also observed some gender differences in that women scored significantly higher than men in harm values, fairness values, and purity values. Men scored slightly higher on loyalty and obedience values. These findings are consistent with other work suggesting gender differences in empathy and disgust sensitivity. They also show an interesting divergence with political correlations, since here, purity is grouped with harm. Interestingly, the researchers discovered that this pattern, where being more left-wing is associated with higher endorsement of care and fairness values than binding values, and being more right-wing is associated with higher endorsement of binding values, it seems to persist around the world. And it actually dwarfs East-West cultural differences that they also found. So this political difference was not limited to just the United States. Graham and colleagues have an observation about these patterns, and they note that across cultures, the most intractable political debates are likely to involve concerns related to respect for traditions or authorities and physical and spiritual purity, whereas the greatest degree of moral commonality might be found in issues related to harm and care. This is a really interesting statement and one to think about. Do you agree? Does this conjecture square with your observations of what seems to fuel conflict in this world? Why or why not? One reason we might not want to conclude that humans may be most alike in terms of their moral valuation of caring, preventing harm, may be work on individual differences in the moral foundations. There's some intriguing findings that these moral concerns tend to be associated with other individual differences about people that help us understand what it means to have these values in a community. For example, researchers have connected the moral foundations to work on prosociality and altruism via attachment theory. And this work leans on Bowlby's early attachment theory that posits that humans are evolutionarily prepared to form attachments to their caregivers. Roughly, when these key attachments go right, the caregiver functions like a secure base for a developing child. The secure base is where a child can go for emotional support or consoling when things go wrong. And then the child can confidently return to other activities without panicking that the base is going to go away. When children are not securely attached, and for whatever reason, and the child does not find the base to be secure, this can lead to anxious or avoidant attachment, forms of insecure attachment. In these cases, the child is either ambivalently attached with the caregiver or has a more detached relationship with the caregiver. Some work has shown that dispositionally secure attachment is related to more altruism and greater compassion than insecure attachment in adulthood. This work suggests that early attachment experiences endure into adulthood as attachment styles that can be reflected in patterns of moral behavior or moral values. In fact, in recent work, the moral foundations have been connected up to attachment styles in adults, in particular attachment insecurity in the form of avoidance or anxious attachment. In adults, avoidance is associated with a distinct set of qualities: distrust, low empathy, cynicism, and anxious attachment with emotionality, heightened empathy, and disgust. The researchers found that avoidant attachment style was related to reduced endorsement of caring and fairness values. And this is controlling for the other foundations and demographics, including age, gender, education, and religious attendance. By contrast, anxious attachment was related to increased endorsement of caring and fairness values and increased endorsement of purity values. The table just shows correlation coefficients, but they ran mediation analyses. And importantly, the relationship between less caring and fairness and relational avoidance and increased caring and fairness and relational anxiety, both of those, it was mediated by people's empathic concern differences, so their empathy. Their developmental experiences, the researchers reasoned, might have altered their empathic concern capabilities. And this in turn affected their expectations and judgments in the moral domain, and also the development of their moral values related to caring for others and fairness. In addition, the relationship between anxiety and increased purity values was mediated by these individuals having increased disgust sensitivity. So there was this emotional root to this. These mediation results are fitting with Haidt's propositions that morality is driven by intuitive emotional responses that differ across the foundations and that are functionally specialized for social purposes. It might not be too surprising that people who are anxiously attached and have heightened emotions and high empathy and disgust also endorse moral values that entail strong views about harm and protection of people from contamination. But it's useful to also know that people with avoidant attachment styles, who are more likely to be low in empathy and prone to distrust and cynicism, they're more likely to not endorse those values of caring and fairness. Ultimately, this work suggests that early attachment experiences could indeed endure into adulthood as relational styles, and then become reflected in patterns of moral behavior and moral values. So maybe we don't all care about caring the same, and maybe environmental influences in our lifetimes, and not just our evolutionarily based impulses, help determine our moral values. Some more questions for review. Research by Turiel showed that people often considered moral and conventional transgressions to have a signature profile. Which element would have disqualified a transgression as a moral transgression, in his view? 1, the transgression is harmful and exploitative. 2, the transgression only occurs in cultures with market economies. 3, the transgression is always very serious. 4, the transgression is wrong, even when commanded by one's leader. In moral philosophy and psychology, morality was considered to involve reasoning about harm and injustice until relatively recently. Which of the following is not considered a moral foundation today? 1, loyalty to the in-group. 2, respect for authority. 3, preserving the planet. 4, avoiding impurity. Mark refused to enter a war zone with the platoon he was leading because he believed there were civilians present. Mark violated one moral foundation and promoted another. Which did he violate? 1, loyalty to the in-group. 2, respect for authority. 3, prevention of harm. Or 4, reducing injustice. The binding values are endorsed more highly by 1, women compared to men. 2, anxiously attached adults compared to securely attached adults. 3, conservatives compared to liberals. 4, middle-income Americans compared to low SES Brazilians.